question and a wonderful opportunity to be here in this way. Sorry, not in person. It made me go back to a book that maybe some of you have read, but it's a really great book, and I still recommend it, which is called The Jew in the Lotus by Roger Kamenetz. It's a great book. It was written in 1991, and it really deals with this whole topic because there was a moment there, and I actually knew the people who, when a group of Jews went to visit the Dalai Lama, and they were led by Reb Zalman and some famous rabbis, Yitzhak Greenberg, and the woman rabbi was Joy Levitt, a Reconstructionist rabbi. In fact, she was a friend of mine, and Joy said to me, Sheila, you should be the one going on this trip. But they asked her because I think she was the editor of the Reconstructionist magazine at the time. In any case, let me give a few general ideas of what was going on there. I think this is my age group, sort of the baby boomers. I was sort of an early baby boomer, 46, and sort of grew up in the 60s. But I think of my parents as second generation Jews. Their parents were immigrants. And that's probably the case from some of us. Or maybe we had immigrant parents ourselves, or maybe we are immigrants. But the fact is that spirituality was not a high priority for my parents. They wanted to make a living. They wanted us to be comfortable. They wanted us to have a good education and be successful in America. That was a priority, get married, have kids, as if you were a girl. It was definitely not about spirituality. And I think actually the Jews that came to the States were not the spiritually inclined Jews. They stayed in Europe. They were the Orthodox, the practicing Jews who actually stayed in Europe. I found this really intense quote. I don't know if this is, I think it was in this book, actually. It said, we lost 30% of the Jews altogether in the Holocaust, but more than 80% of scholars, mystics, and teachers who could pass on ancient traditions. My grandparents, they weren't religious or observant, but for the most part, they were interested in coming to America and making a living and getting out of their suffering in Europe. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, there are many parts. Another part is the Jewish Enlightenment. Following the Enlightenment in Europe, Jews sort of made a bargain with Europe, in a sense, mostly Western Europe, but then it moved into Eastern Europe. You may have heard of Moses Mendelssohn, that we're going to buy into a lot of the intellectual and let go of some of the things that make us different, including our spirituality. It was an age of reason. The mind was the dominant, not the spirit, not the heart. And Jewish education, Wissenschaft der Judentum, the study of the study of Judaism as an intellectually rigorous study. That's what dominated in many cases, not completely. There were the Martin Bubers and there were a few other people. But what happened was in this country, I would say that spiritually oriented Jews, let's put it this, Jews interested in the inner life were attracted to psychology. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a few psychologists even on this call. And psychology was a very Jewish, secular, non-religious, non-spiritual exploration of the inner life. Freud was a Jew. All the big psychologists were Jewish, except for Jung. So that was a lot of what happened. And Buddhism was not so much in the West, although it had inspired some people, like even William James was inspired by Buddhism, and Henry David Thoreau, earlier non-Jews, Christians. But as the world kind of gets smaller and there began to move into this country some of the Buddhists, some of the Buddhist teachers, that also happened in the 60s and 70s. Another thing that happened was a bunch of people went on the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps, I actually was on the Peace Corps myself. We wanted to do good, John F. Kennedy, and I, by chance, ended up with my husband at the time in Chile, South America. So it was not a spiritual journey, although I did connect with the Jewish community there, which was very interesting. But a bunch of Jews ended up in Asia. And for the most part, that's what introduced them to Buddhism. And I'm talking about Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, especially, but also John McCrancy. Some of you may have seen the thing with them. Ended up, and there were many, many others. There was a interest, Ram Dass, Richard Alpert. You know, when it comes to Philadelphia, John McCransky, who happens to be a teacher of mine, grew up in Abington, and he then went to Asia as a young man in the Peace Corps and was exposed to Tibetan Buddhism. And then he decided he was going to become a professor of comparative religion and Buddhism, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the psychology and spirituality, if you were in psychology, the Buddhist language really could speak to you. When you didn't really, you were longing, you were looking for something. And Judaism was about belonging, very important, and sort of rationalism, but it didn't so much as speak to the heart at that time. So there's a continuum, as I see it, between psychology and spirituality in terms of making the hidden revealed. Really acknowledging that we are so much more than just what is in our minds and so much more than appears on the surface. And also more of our potential, more of our connection, and finding wisdom. I just want a little quote here from the Jew in the Lotus. I really recommend it. It's very well written. He's a good writer, Roger Kamenetz. The special thing in Buddhism is we are given the methods of development. We aren't just to have compassion for others, but how to train your mind for compassion. You would get the idea, use it, be good, be compassionate. But Buddhism had a training of the mind, like psychology in a sense. And then he says here, this is really good in terms of that question, Richard. Direct experience of meditation was key to Joseph Goldstein, one of the 4 Jubus, founders of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. That was in the 70s, very important institution. And then it broke off and they started Spirit Rock. This is a quote. A year or 2 into my practice, I came back to the States, this is Joseph, and met with a rabbi who had bar mitzvahed me. He was very upset that I was leaving the Jewish fold, which is how he saw it. For me, the real difference was that insofar as I understood it, the path of Judaism involved following the vision, the law of someone else's experience. I used the Old Testament prophets as an example. I told them I was interested in having that experience. I wasn't interested in taking it on faith and trying to live up to it. That's a pretty powerful, and Allen Ginsberg, there's another one, the poet, Jew. He writes, he explained Trungpa. Trungpa was a Tibetan teacher, came to founder of Naropa in Boulder. Allen Ginsberg explained Trungpa's great success with Jewish students as due to his language. For the first time, he expounded Buddhist Dharma with a Yiddish accent. He didn't really have a Yiddish accent, but anyway, that's how they heard it. A lot of his students had been Jewish, and he understood New Yorkese, Hymietown dialect. For instance, the Buddhist notion of suffering as in existence is suffering, he could translate as service. I never heard that, and I never studied with Rinpoche, but anyway, it's a good quote. So the question is, and they asked this question, one of the leaders of this group was a guy who never denied his Judaism. A lot of these people did deny their Judaism. They would say they're Buddhists, they're not Jews. Not all. Some, like Mark Lieberman, who was a doctor, he just passed away recently. He was one of the organizers of this trip, never denied his Judaism. And many others did not deny their Judaism. There's another factor, which is that, first of all, post-Holocaust, they said that disappearance, the murder of so many incredible Jewish teachers and connectors to Jewish spiritual wisdom. Judaism has enormous mystical spiritual depths that weren't taught to us. They were lost, and then they somewhat were recovered. Martin Buber is a good bridge, but Gershom Scholem, who is a professor in the 20th century, basically 19th, 20th century, ended up in Israel, recovered Jewish mysticism for the Enlightenment, in a sense. People like Alexander Altman, these people survived the Holocaust. Altman came to Brandeis. Then he had students, Arthur Green, Michael Fishbane, Daniel Matt, who became a teacher. These were people who started studying Jewish mysticism and realized the depth within Jewish mysticism. Then you have all of the Hasidic traditions, which weren't accessible to liberal Jews, that are based on spirituality, meditation, people like Aryeh Kaplan, too, who wrote a book in the 70s on Jewish meditation, because he had access. A lot of it he made up on his own. Nachum Glatzer. It's very interesting. So I would say Art Green was a very significant bridge, including to the recon movement, as he had his little brief sojourn in that in our movement. So I guess that's really what I have to say about this topic. And I want to go on and talk about my own experience, but Richard, maybe you want to ask me whatever you want to ask me. I wanted to share with you some of my own experience of when I was introduced to Buddhism and how I moved it over to understand it in Judaism.
No, that's really wonderful. Just one quick question.
Yeah.
Does any of this relate to the founding of the Jewish Renewal Movement and our friends at B'nai Or in Mount Airy?
Yeah, great. Yes, definitely. So Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who I met and was a very important teacher to me before I was introduced to Buddhism. Zalman was a key link, a survivor. And he had several qualities that Zalman had. I met Zalman in 1977 when I first moved to Philadelphia. Before there was a renewal movement, there was B'nai Or, and then they changed it to B'nai Or because B'nai was too sexist. And Zalman and Shlomo, really. Shlomo Carlebach, who has his own reputation, which is problematic. But Zalman and Shlomo were shlichim. They were sent by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to America, basically. They were both Hasidim. Zalman wasn't so much raised Hasidic, but he absorbed Hasidut, and he absorbed the Jewish mysticism. And was also a genius, brilliant guy. And when they got to America and they started going around and teaching, they were like the first of the Chabadnikim, in a sense. But Zalman, had his own trajectory. Shlomo had his trajectory. Zalman's trajectory was to connect to America. And he started meeting people. And he started meeting really interesting people like Ram Dass and Howard Thurman and Thomas Merton and he was open to non-Jews. He was open to spirituality. He was open to the Buddhist stuff. He ended up teaching it in Europa, which was founded by Buddhists. Zalman, that was his last position. So followers of Zalman were interested in reviving Jewish spirituality in America. And it was Zalman wasn't that keen on sitting practice and silence that much. He was more interested in what we might call ecstatic practice. Davanology, he would call it. And but he valued what we were doing later on. He definitely valued what we were doing in the mindfulness area. So yeah, there's an overlap. I always think of myself, even though I'm a Reconstructionist, I really consider myself part of the Reconstructionists primarily, but I'm probably on the Reconstructionist renewal edge. If I had to belong somewhere. But I
That's
don't
great.
do renewal stuff. I don't go to their conferences and this. I don't go to the Reconstructionists either. But I pay my dues to the recons.
That's great. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you as you go on to help us define the term spirituality and what Jewish spirituality might be during what you're going to tell us now.
Yeah, I'd like to read this to you because I think it gives you an idea of the sort of the development. I wrote this 20 years ago, but when I went back to see it, I said, well, yeah, pretty much, it's kind of the right thing. So I graduated RC in 86, and then I was the rabbi here from 85 to 89, 4 years at Beth Am Israel in Narberth. And then I moved to Amherst, Massachusetts, where I was the rabbi in 1989. And this is the background of it. The man who was on the search committee there, it was an unaffiliated synagogue. And the man now it's a Reconstructionist congregation, but he was also on the board of Insight Meditation Society. And he was also looking for the rabbi. So he was already mixing it up himself. This was 1989, although they were separate for him. And anyway, he encouraged me to go on a retreat at Insight Meditation Society, which I did in 1990, a 10-day retreat, my first 10-day meditation retreat. And the teacher was a man named Christopher Titmus, and I had a roommate who wasn't that interested in the silence. This is 10 days of silence. And I was sitting, walking, and I was completely silent for 10 days. And I was alone with my own mind, sitting, walking, eating, doing my yogi job. What they call the yogi job was pot washing, sitting, walking. And then finally in the evening, Christopher or Sharda, who was the other teacher, would speak, and there would be some relief from my own mind. And then I would go to sleep and dream and get up early and begin again. I mean, there were meals, obviously, but they were all silent. And the sitting was painful. I had pain in my back, in my neck, my shoulders most of the time. I was sleepy a lot. I was distracted most of the time. I couldn't pay attention to the directions. I felt pretty hopeless, useless, inferior, a fraud as a spiritual person. And I was the rabbi of the synagogue. And I felt like I was a failure and an imposter. And despite all this, the teachings were incredible. And it felt as if the teachers had been in my mind throughout the day. Their words created a sense of spaciousness. The process of returning again and again to the simple object of attention, the breath, the step, the pot I was scrubbing, was expanding the dimension of my mind. All the painful thoughts, the judgments, the fears, the endless desires for this or that to be different were being seen, really. They were becoming visible, and in that visibility, losing their grip to some degree. I understood that the teachers were teaching Buddhism. Now, they were teaching was this Americanized version of Buddhism, that they were, okay, because they were Americans. Christopher, I think, was British, but they were Westerners. They were teaching a Westernized version of Buddhism, but nonetheless Buddhism. And stories they told in the text they cited were Buddhist. At IMS, it was always very clear they couldn't care less if you became a Buddhist. They weren't interested in you becoming a Buddhist. And this was critical for me because I had no intentions of becoming a Buddhist. And as the days progressed, I started translating their teachings into Jewish language. So I understood the reference to suffering, craving, and the conditioned I that is always wanting attention and amusement as equivalent to the false gods and idolatry of Judaism. How indeed do we recognize and weed out idol worship from our own hearts? How do we end or at least mitigate suffering? How do we heal the wounds, the trauma that the walls of separation that we erect to keep ourselves, others, itself away, or God, spirit? How do we see the transient and the fleeting and distinguish that from the eternal and enduring? How do we deal with our own destructive habits without destroying each other or ourselves? How do we recognize what is fantasy, delusion, and what is truth? What are the stories that rule our lives? So to me, those are Buddhist questions. They're Jewish questions. They're recovery questions. If anybody knows about 12-step recovery, which is important in my story, they are human questions. So I was moved by the practice of mindfulness, and my entire being was engaged. And I saw how the stories in my mind proliferate. I saw that when I allow my attention to rest on sensation in my body, I see dynamism, change, and instability. Things become loose. I am less a victim. I open myself to the infinite power of pure awareness. And more as time goes by, that's how I like to talk about God, as loving awareness. The light of presence, living presence. I open to the nameless energy of life that just is. I open to compassion. In Jewish language, I open to God's love, the power that heals, forgives, comforts, and through the pure act of presence, ultimately transforms. I see infinite references to this process of liberation in Jewish prayer, in the texts of Torah, and in the practices of Jewish life. And that's pretty much been my life since this, is just sort of pulling those together. I experienced how hatred and contention lock in and experience and deepen suffering. I understand through attentive patience and self-honesty that the more I open to what is arising in this moment, the more balanced and clear my mind, and the more able I am to make wise and compassionate choices. The more shalom, wholeness, or peace is created, the more tikkun, mending the shattered and divisive nature of reality, is achieved. The teachings that I heard at that first retreat have been reinforced at many other retreats with many other brilliant teachers. Now it's over the last 30 years, I suppose, as well as through my own practice, various practices. The teachings and practice of mindfulness have entered my life to inspire and sustain and strengthen me. I now teach mindfulness, and I have taught mindfulness to Jews using the language of Jewish story and symbol. The key factor is that people are given a chance to see for themselves the nature of their mind when they sit on a mindfulness retreat or even do a short practice of mindfulness, to know impermanence personally, not just because I say it, to see the insubstantiality of the separate self, to experience the interconnection of all beings, and to know viscerally both the causes of suffering and the end of suffering. The principles are easy to articulate and very difficult to practice. We ask ourselves to tell the truth, to be engaged with a community of seekers and practitioners. That's very important, that we have support, to keep returning to one's intention, to develop tolerance for the other, the different, the unknown, the unpleasant, the frightening, to develop curiosity and a keen desire and ability to listen. Listen, listen, listen. Shema Yisrael. Listen up, Israel, is the passionate Jewish affirmation of unity and interconnection. The impact of Buddhism on my life as a Jew has been to give me a new lens with which to interpret and understand the sacred teachings of my people and more deeply apply those teachings to my life. Now, this has been up and down, obviously, over the last 30 years. To what end? To what end? What's the point? To live with more awareness, more compassion, more wisdom, and more love. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. More, not perfect. I've discovered that we cultivate wholeness when we learn to pay awakened attention without pushing away, grabbing, or fleeing. That leads us to a contentment that transcends the vagaries of changing phenomenon. The contentedness of the psalmist who wrote, Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha. Happy are those who dwell in your house, the house of this body, mind, and the house of life in this complex, ever more and more complex, it seems to be, reality, and the house of this struggling planet can all be embraced when we sit down and partake of the infinite clarity of awareness. So I closed this little teaching with a poem I wrote on a retreat I went to some years ago, a 1-month retreat, and it's based on a teaching about the 2 sets of tablets that Moses received. But I've continued to, make this. We have a group at Germantown Jewish Center that meets every Tuesday, and twice a month I teach 10 minutes on the Parsha leading into a 20-minute mindfulness sit. It's all interpreted, and this Jewish mindfulness teacher, how do we look at our Jewish teachings? Not that this is the only way to look at it. There's plenty of ways to look at it, but this is one hermeneutic, as we would say, one form of way of looking into our work that brings it into ourselves. And if it brings it into ourselves as liberation, then it moves out into the world as well. So the teaching is about this set of tablets. Upon descending from Sinai, seeing the Israelites worshiping the golden calf, he smashes the first set. Later on, he's given a second set, and both sets are placed in the Holy Ark together. So this was my way of expressing the insight I received and keep receiving. They all dwell together in the Holy Ark, the whole tablets and the broken pieces, the fear, greed, the envy, the judgment, the hunger, the rage, all these jagged slabs, all of this too, the wanting, the bragging, the dreaming, the impatience, the intolerance, it's all here in a human package, along with the courage, the love, the generosity, the energy, the joy, the wisdom, the tenderness, all there, all mixed together, a human being, separate and unique, related and the same as you and me, from the broken bits, but the broken bits have no enduring substance. They soon turn to dust, and the whole tablets are the ark, contained in and containing all. So I don't know if I answer your question about Jewish spirituality, but I could blab on about that for a long time. So see where you want to go with this now, Richard. It's up to you and the people.
Well, we'll open it up to questions soon, but how does this relate to our traditional both ritual of Judaism and our halakha, our Jewish laws, the foundational stuff that we deal with? Why should one do the rituals of Jewish prayer? Why is that necessary or useful if we could do what you're saying? And do we still, in the context of what you're saying, relate to our traditional law and teachings?
Well, it's up to you. If you want to, you can. That's my point. If you want to stay connected to Jewish tradition, which I think is fantastic and beautiful and deep, both, the Torah, as well as the prophetic tradition, as well as the tradition of interpretation. See, we have a container, we have a peoplehood, we have an inheritance. We have inherited Judaism, or we've been attracted to it and decided this was something that we love. So in either case, we married into it in some form or fashion, but it's something we care about. It has survived. It's our ancestors. And the beauty of it is a tradition of interpretation. So, there's been a lot of different interpretations, and there continue to be. So as far as I am not so much I'm certainly not an Orthodox Jew, but I believe, and I see we're guided in Judaism for many, many really good things like kashrut. So what does that mean? To eat consciously. So we can put that in the context of kashrut. Shabbat. Okay, Shabbat is a time to be more conscious, be more aware. Prayer is to open us. Our prayer is to gather together, to open our hearts, to open our awareness so that we can settle and feel spacious and held. So we have, and Torah study, which I guess I particularly love as Jewish practice, being a rabbi and everything, I suppose I was attracted to that. I'm attracted to prayer too, but that's not my strong suit. I'm not like a great prayer leader. I always rely on other people to do that and really to develop that. So meditation really worked for me as a form of prayer, as integrated with prayer. But Torah study, every time you look at the Parsha, what is this? This is a lens. And then we have peoplehood. I am a reconstruction. We have peoplehood. We have belonging. We have gathering together. We have supporting each other, and look, this isn't for everybody. Everybody doesn't have these psychological bent, I do believe I'm also very interested in social justice issues, and I see them as mirroring the mind. How do we develop structures in our society that support our loving kindness, our generosity, our compassion? The structures of our society don't necessarily support the best we can be. They oftentimes support competitiveness, fear, anxiety, separation, judgment, So it's a prophetic journey. It's a prophetic, the prophets had visions. I love the prophets, identify with the prophets. And, it's very Kaplanian, because Kaplan said, you have to living in two civilizations. I used to say this at the beginning when people accused me of becoming a Buddhist. I said, I'm interested in Buddhism. What does it mean to live in two civilizations? Which is the other civilization? Is the other civilization capitalism, the marketplace? Kaplan did not think it was. He certainly did. He wrote very clearly that it wasn't materialism. For a lot of Jews, that is the other civilization, materialism. Kaplan wrote that our task is to see what is the best in the culture that we happen to be living in. And I think one of the best things right now is this importation of mindfulness, of healing, of this kind of spirituality. That might be the best other civilization that we could live in tandem with. At least that's been my argument. Now, if you're not interested in Judaism, I'm not, there are people who are, practicing Buddhists, but they're Jews, and they come across this and it's very healing for them to say that they can be both. There are others who say, I'm satisfied being a Buddhist. Joseph Goldstein's not coming back to the Jews, I'll tell you that much. But I worked for many years with Sylvia Boorstein, who was one of the major Jewish teachers. She's also a beloved friend of mine. We taught together. She was really interested in Judaism. She teaches at her synagogue now. She's one of the main teachers at Spirit Rock, very well known. And she teaches in her synagogue, and she teaches from the Parsha. So, she synthesized these two. I don't know if that answers you, Richard, but.
No, that's great. I'd like to open it up to questions. So several ways we could do that. For people who are on camera, if you just raise your hand. For people who are off camera, perhaps go to the reactions section and raise your hand, or drop something in the chat. And then when I call on you, please unmute yourself. So would anybody like to question? Pat Steinberg.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you so much. This is fascinating and important to me. And thank you, Rich, for great leadership and great direction and questions that you've done so far. Okay, my question, to get to my question, at one point when you were defining spirituality, you got to a point where you said it's easy to articulate. And my question is, this was after you had spent quite a long time defining it. So it just leads me to think that, the crux of the matter of why Jews look elsewhere sometimes is just not accessible. It takes a lot of intention, and it takes time, to do all this. And while, a lot of Judaism is focused on education and tikkun olam, there's much less of focus on spirituality, and people just give up and go elsewhere, like either now or in the past. So if you'd address that.
Yeah, we have it reminds me of the two Hebrew terms, keva and kavanah. We have the idea of regularity, which is important, regularity, and kavanah, intention. And there's probably, like what you say, not enough has been devoted to kavanah. Do it, but why? But why? But how is it going to serve you and the world? Maybe we haven't talked enough about that. And the Hasidim write about that all the time, inner intention. And there's so much written about what's the inner transformational intention, and you're right. It's much harder. Just doing it is a lot easier than actually bringing your awareness to. It's that's why I say maybe it's on the psychology spirituality continuum. One has to sort of be psychologically comfortable enough to be able to go deeper, and what we just want to do is sort of just, okay, we'll go through the motions. I don't know. I mean, I also used to say when one of my favorite sayings, I did this in this congregation, I'm a liberal Jew. I believe that I want to be open. I want to be open. And so the tendency is when we're open, we get shallow. If we're closed, we can go deep. And you find this in the ultra-Orthodox. The closed goes deep. And a lot of people are attracted to that but it's so closed. And I don't want to be that.
I'm not sure what you mean by closed. I don't understand.
Closed, I mean, we're doing it the right way. We're not interested in other people's stuff.
Okay.
We're doing it. It's our thing, and we're doing it the right way. And this is the way it's done. It's almost like fundamentalism, and it's just our community, and we dress the way we dress, and we daven the way we daven, and we're closed. We're close to women. Never mind, But liberal Jews are open. We're open to LGBTQ. We're open to, the whole 9 yards. We're open to. So it tends that openness, and this is very, I'm saying this is kind of a superficial way of thinking about it, but I think it's true in general. It's a big generalization. So the challenge is how to be open and deep. That's what I'm looking for. Open and deep.
Well, I'm saying I don't want to take too much time, but I like our rituals, our Jewish rituals, people just, liberal Jews, just not many of us are doing them because people look at them and say, this is pointless to me. So they're not at the place, to even open. So, and I just.
When I mean open to diversity.
When I said open, they're not like ready to try it.
Right. That's a different, I wasn't meaning that by open, but yeah, I think you're right.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah. You're very welcome. Thank you. Very, helpful.
Vivian Kane, please.
Can you comment on 12-step spirituality?
Yeah, I have two books that I wrote, one called Surprisingly Happy, and the other one is called God Loves a Stranger. And Surprisingly Happy was I called it an atypical Jewish memoir. And in it, I talk about my own journey of recovery, because I had 12 very important recovery story I have, which at first I didn't want to share. I'm sober. It'll be 35 years, 36 years in the spring. And it was incredible. And I have to tell you, I was already a rabbi. I was ordained in 86 and I got into sobriety in 87. So it was amazingly important to me. I didn't bring it up here. It came before my introduction to Buddhism, but came before my trip to Amherst. I was a high functioning alcoholic, very high functioning, obviously. And people would say, what, no, but I very, very much had to get sober, and was part of my journey. And I am to this day unbelievably grateful to the 12 steps and the 11th step, so through prayer and meditation. But I could not open to meditation while I was still drinking. I tried. I had a friend who was a meditator and she told me to go to retreat, but I thought I was going to get sober on a retreat. It was not a good idea. It had to come first, actually. It was really the first step. Now, not to say I wasn't a spiritually oriented person. I was, very much so. And I was dominating, and I was and very, very important to me. I think the 12 steps are brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And I did write about the 12 steps in Judaism early on in my sobriety. I wrote about, I did various stuff. I published stuff about it. I haven't so much lately, but it's still a very, very important part. I haven't spoken about it, and I wrote about it. I wrote about it in my memoir. And even though, you're anonymous, but I felt it was important for me to say it. And now there are rabbis, and there's Beit Tshuva, and there's rabbis who coming out, and it's a different time than 1987. Yeah, I mean, the book was, the first book was like, I don't know, 2010. So that was quite a bit after I had gotten sober.
For those of us who aren't particularly familiar with 12 steps, can either Vivian or Sheila clarify how this fits together?
Yeah, in fact, there's some really good books about, Rami Shapiro has written some very good books about 12-step spirituality. Started in the 30s, basically. It was by two alcoholics who were in recovery. And they started groups of alcoholics and developed this methodology, basically, that it was spiritually oriented, but not religiously oriented, although there are 12-step groups that are Christian based, but it really, they also had an Eastern flow to them. And the 12 steps are the steps you take. They're very simple, but again, you do them in groups, and you do them with sponsors and people who have, the 12th step is the step that says, now I can help another, so it's one recovering, and there are many, many, many programs now. It started with alcoholics, but overeaters, drug addicts of different kinds, people who are addicted to other people, who are struggling, sexual addictions, gambling. There are lots and lots and lots of what it's the revealing the concealed. It comes into that same category. Is there's so much fear around admitting. It's the first step is admitting I was an addict and that I'm powerless over my addiction. I can't do it by myself. I need help. And there are other variations of it, alternatives, which I don't know that much about. But for me, it was a 12 steps. There's a book, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. There's something called the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which has people's stories, and it continues to develop. And there are lots. A lot of the meetings happen at churches, but they happen everywhere. Synagogues too. And there's a lot to be said about it, but that kind of gives you the quick quick take on it.
Bill, did you have a question?
Yeah, Rabbi, again, thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion. Can you say any more about the connection between Jewish spirituality and Tikkun Olam? I know you commented on social justice, but one of the major criticisms of mysticism and Jewish mysticism, or any mysticism, is that it's the focus on the self is a withdrawal from the world. So where does that withdrawal connect with the desire to improve the world?
That's a great question. And that's been a question that I have actually contemplated for a long time, and really tried to I write about and teach about and lift up. And I think it's very, very important. And Buddhists also have some concern about that in this country. And there's been a fair amount of writing about mindfulness and activism and spiritual, in all these ways. People are working with it because you're totally right. There is a way of using mysticism as withdrawal. And to me, that's not Jewish. That's just not Jewish, because we are engaged. Look, they're Buddhist monks. They don't have children. They don't have partners. They don't believe in continuing the generations. That's not Jewish. Jewish mindfulness really is profoundly connected to the world through family, community, and considering systems of oppression. So when we look at our own minds, we also recognize that we are in systems. I alluded to this. We recognize that we are in systems that promote separation, whether it's greed or hatred, fear. And our goal is to work for the alleviation, for justice, for peace and healing in the world, in the systems with which we live. Now, many people are activists and they work for justice and tikkun, but they do it out of their own fear and separation and anger and hatred. And there's a lot of burnout as well in the social justice area, something that a lot of young people are working with now. I just heard this thing on the radio about some of the environmental activists, like in Sunrise Movement, but also in Sierra Club and Greenpeace, are realizing that activists burn out so badly that they have to now teach self-care and working with your own fear, terror, and in doing the inner work. So I think that's exactly the focus of Jewish mindfulness, is how do we balance, the inner work and the outer work, and when we first started this, people would say, yeah, you're Buddhist, it's navel gazing, but if we don't do the work of our own selves, our work out there in the world will be blindsided by our blindness. Is my view, it's my feeling.
Thank you. Can I ask that people who've already spoke, please mute themselves? We're getting some echoes. And Manny Rosenberg would like to ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much for allowing us to have a session with you today, Rabbi. What spiritual text or authors have been most important to you? Jewish spiritual texts and authors.
I would say Art Green, Mordechai Kaplan. Art Green is probably the outstanding spiritual writer. Michael Fishbane, some of his stuff is hard to enter into, although his commentary on the Song of Songs is incredible. This work also started with me around Jewish feminism. So I've been deeply influenced by Judith Plaskow and her writing and her work, including Standing Again at Sinai. And in terms of Torah, right now, my go-to book is the Torah Women's Commentary which I think is incredible and brilliant, because I bring that with myself, you know. Martin Buber, wonderful biography of Martin Buber that I read recently. Very, very moving. I mean, he comes similar generation to Kaplan in a way. Paul Mendes Floor, really fantastic. You know, the teacher of Zohar, who's had a tremendous impact on me because she is I taught with her for many years and is an amazing teacher of Zohar, Jewish mysticism, is an Israeli woman named Melila Helner Eshed. She lives in Israel, and she is an Israeli, and she wrote a book, her first book, River Flows Through Eden, which is a book on the Zohar. And then she has just come out with a book on the Idra, which is another part of the Zohar. But we taught together for many years, and far be it from me to think of myself as a scholar of Jewish mysticism or of the Zohar. And, you know, the work we did with the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, which I really didn't talk about, has been a very important lifting up of Hasidic texts that have been interpreted by a variety of scholars, including Jonathan Slater and Sam Feinsmith, who's an amazing teacher, hasn't published, Jonathan did, but interpretations of Hasidic texts through a mindfulness lens. And they publish weekly teachings on mindfulness and Jewish spiritual, classic Jewish spiritual texts. There's one, so you can subscribe to that, and they do a lot of work. So I've been introduced to a lot of spiritual teachers like the Sfat Emet, many, many others that Art Green, I would say probably the foremost teacher in this way at this time. And Art Green just keeps producing and producing and producing. He kind of doesn't stop, even though he's in his 80s. He's coming out with a book on prayer, I know, because my friend is doing the editing of it, his prayer interpretations. You know, the only reason I got into the whole thing with writing commentaries, I have to thank David Teutsch, you know, who said, you know, can you write some commentaries? I was like, what? You know, so then there are many others. There are many others. Shai Held is an amazing teacher and does, I like his work very much. But the Institute for Jewish Spirituality is really an amazing resource. I think it's unique in the Jewish world.
Thank you for such a thorough answer.
Something I deal with a lot, I guess.
I dropped in the chat for people who are interested the link to the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and the link to Rabbi Weinberg's own site.
My site, which is out of date, but nonetheless, it has a lot of stuff on it. Some nice pictures.
A lot of the stuff is not new.
Yeah, and the books are there.
Anybody else like to ask a question on the Zoom? Yes, Nadine Kenter.
I had to find my unmute, sorry. Thank you so much, Rabbi. I was wondering, so much of what you've been speaking about today, what Reconstructionist speaks about, I feel is something that young people today can really embrace. As the mother of a son who's intermarried and a daughter who really doesn't have much use for Judaism, as she says, I worry about, they have tremendous background. They can, you know, sit at a Seder and do everything. They can attend a service and participate, yet they don't seek it out. Is there some way to pull them in?
That's the $1 million question, I suppose. I do work with the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College now, and as a spiritual director. So I have 7 students that I work with, and they're amazing. I work with them in a one-on-one way. I'm very impressed by them. They're great. They're just great. And they're coming up with new ways of reaching out to the next generation, I think. I really think. I'm very, very moved by them. They have different ways of looking. Now, you know, you go to West Philly, there's a really vibrant Recon synagogue there called Tzedek. It's their age group. It's super active and it's growing, growing, growing. You know, I think young people don't want to hang out with their parents and grandparents for the most part, you know. They need their own thing. I mean, that's why camping is so successful. You know, the Israel trips have been very successful in certain ways, you know, more like, I don't know if the Recon are into it. You know, social justice is compelling. There's now this group Dayenu. I don't know if people want to do it as Jews. They're looking to reach out to Jews, young Jews who want to do they want to do environmental justice work as Jews, inspired by Judaism or as Jews. I mean, there are groups, there actually are groups starting up. Will they reach your kids? You know, maybe your kids don't have kids at this point.
Well, I have one that's expecting.
Okay, so that shifts it. You know, that shifts the generational perspective to some degree, usually does. Now, interestingly enough, the RC made a decision to take intermarried families, intermarried couples, and rabbinical students are intermarried. I think it was a brilliant move. They reached out to a huge new population of the people that I work with. The three that have you know, committed relationships all are with non-Jews. And I never would have thought of that. Believe me, 30 years ago, it never would have occurred to me. But it's a new day. It's a new day. And in a sense, the new generations have to figure it out. The one thing you can take some comfort in is that, you know, the Jews have been around a long time. They can find ways of doing it. I don't know. I mean, I was lucky. I don't know how, but both of my kids are like super involved in Judaism. My stepson, who I adore and was 11 when he came into my family, is married to a non-Jew. And as much as I preached and blah, 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 and they have 2 kids, not interested. They're not Christians, but they doing Jews. Although my 9-year-old, a couple of years ago, she said to me, Grandma, I am half Jewish and half not Jewish. So you never know.
Thank you.
That's great. I dropped in the chat again a link to Dayenu if anybody wants to open that up. David Schwartz had a question.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm not sure if what I had was exactly a question or a comment or somewhere in between. I studied with Reb Zalman at times, and one of the things that stuck with me from what he said was that the social fabric has become brittle. And that's the case in my experience personally. And so the 12 steps has been a major, I actually consider it my main spiritual practice today, even though I daven every day with talis and tefillin. But I've stopped going to minions. And I sort of have stopped going to shul altogether. And it's because of community. And I can really see why a lot of Jews over time may have been drawn to other traditions where the community model is different than the conventional Jewish model, which is around family and tribe kind of thing. And if there's a breakdown in the family and tribe kind of way of doing things, where is there a space and a place for me? You know, that kind of, and if I go to another model where I'm welcome and I feel like connected and I have like a new family kind of environment, I feel like welcome, like in a new family, that's very enticing, and it fills an important need that in our traditional Jewish communities, in older times, it seems to me, Jews were just connected as Jews, whether they were spiritually oriented or not. There was a place for everyone in some way. but that's changed. And some part of me wonders, is there another possibility for models or new models that are coming out that can be even modeled on some other traditions for Jewish?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. And, a lot of what we were modeling on in America was Protestantism in the synagogue, Protestant churches. They're having the same experience of dwindling numbers and closing down. So, part of what we're experiencing in synagogues is very similar to other American phenomenon. I think that's partly what Zalman was saying, and that's partly true. I mean, I think there are multiple responses. I mean, there are people that go to synagogue to do yoga that is taught in a Jewish idiom. There is a whole phenomenon of Jewish yoga where you can do it online through the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. There's a yoga session every week. A fantastic teacher, Cantor Lizzie Shamash, who happens to live in Philadelphia. We trained teachers to do Jewish mindfulness. Now, I'll just give you an example of our Tuesday morning. Now, okay, it's not Shabbos. We have to do Shabbos differently. Nowadays, the whole thing is crazy with the Zoom because you could go anywhere for Shabbos. You can have an experience in Israel. The hours get a little cockamamie, but okay, you go to New York. You can go to tons of people go to the Central Synagogue or BJ, but we do a Tuesday morning sit. And we have like our 30 people that come, and there's a teaching and there's a sit, and then there's a share. There's a share. It's not a AA share, but it's a share. Who are you praying for? Who are you saying Kaddish for? Do you want to respond to the teaching in some way and the sit? And people share from their hearts. So it becomes like there's like a bond, a little bit of a bond to that. And it also doesn't last for 3.5 hours. It's an hour, like a meeting. And it starts with 15 minutes of Qigong. So there's some, I don't know, but there are a lot of synagogues that have similar groups on Shabbos and there's a lot of people that come together because they like to study Torah. And that is interactive. Sometimes, though, it gets problematic because you get competitive and people's not. But the nice thing about the sitting, just like the protocol AA, is there's a safety. There's a feeling of safety. I can be safe. How can I be in a spiritual place where I'm safe? Where I'm not going to be like, and what are you doing now? Assaulted by competitiveness and people pushing themselves at me in ways I don't necessarily want. So I don't know. I'm not giving you answers, but those are, I think I share your questions.
Thank you. Rich Davis, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabbi, for being here. This has just been amazing. Let's just say 15 years ago, everything blew up in my life and I lost relationships with family and friends. And I had to find something to hold on to. And the first thing I found to hold on to, thank God, was my 12-step recovery. Today, I've got 15 years of recovery and I've got, multiple 12-step programs that I dabble in that work because I found that road to spirituality works in my life and strengthens me and gives me community. But my problem is that I'm trying to juggle that with my Judaism because I needed a yontif really, really bad that year. And I shopped around and I found Or Chadash, which was and has been and continues to be just an amazing place. So I certainly know that for myself, at least, I can combine my Jewish practices, which I became a Saturday morning regular, and then I was keeping a meeting open in a church basement on a Friday night. Nobody else was coming, so I stopped going, and then that closed, and then I became a Friday night regular. And so there was always been a place for me to go to be with people who were like-minded and who wanted to learn together and study and talk and pray together. And we actually have now here at Or Hadash a 12-step Chabara, which has been going on for, I don't know, maybe a year. But it's a group, and we use Rami Shapiro's book. And we just read a couple pages and share, and once a month. And I just heard recently that in Detroit, there's another Reconstructionist congregation, and they're using Rabbi Mark, the Daily Reader. I forget the name of the book, but it's a book that is yeah, and they're using something different. We haven't contacted them yet. We're discussing it as a group, but what we're going to do. But the idea of the integration of the, and I also have disclosed my own mental illness now in this phase of my life, but putting that all together is fine, but confusing. And my two grandsons, neither one has been yeah, they're learning all how to be Jewish. Neither one had a bris, and I can imagine my daughter wouldn't want to bring together the family because there's no family to bring together. It's just too complex, and I can understand her decision. But they're coming along. Everybody's coming along. My question, though, to you is this: could you talk a little bit more, maybe, about Rabbi Olitsky and Twersky, and certainly Rabbi Rami Shapiro, to the extent that how has Buddhism, has that practice influenced them, do you feel? Because I know that they write in a 12-step way.
Well, I can certainly talk about Rami Shapiro because he was a student of Buddhism. He was very much a student of Buddhism early on in his career. I think in undergraduate or graduate school, he studied with, so he's very, very Buddhist oriented, even though he wasn't part of our thing for whatever reason. There's another, Rabbi Twersky, I don't know. I mean, 12 steps, Judaism, I don't know. And Olitsky, I don't know. I don't know. Twersky's books were very important to me at a certain point. Olitsky, I'm not sure where he fits in exactly. The one I really admire, not 12 steps, but Buddhism and Judaism, Alan Liu. His books are amazing, and they're really worth reading. His two books, not so much his autobiography, but the one on the High Holiday period, very important and very, very influential. And his other book on his journey, very important. He's no longer alive, but very, very, very important. And yeah, Rami Shapiro has two books on recovery, and I thought they were great. Really great. Also used them. I used them with a Chavruta. We studied them together. I wanted just to mention more or less for the other your earlier question about the kids and where are they going. So my son, who's a rabbi, graduate of Recon, and is divorced with two young kids, and is he's in process himself. I mean, he's had various careers. He did a lot of camping, and he did work in JCCs, and now he has a fellowship to work with families of Jews who are divorced, who have kids. And how does that work in the Jewish world? Or single parents, which there are more of, or Jews by choice, who maybe are Jews by choice, and then, so marginal groups. And I mean, he's trying to develop something in the Philly area. If you know anybody that's interested in this, I mean, he's involved in a fellowship that is moving him in that direction. So, and then he's with 6 rabbis, and they all have these out of synagogue outreach kinds of idea programs that they're operating on for, so people, God bless the Jews, everybody's always coming up with new ideas. I don't worry so much about the Jewish future. And the other point that was made, unfortunately, I mean, for very fortunately, we don't live in a burning moment of anti-Semitism. A huge amount of Jewish acceptance. There was no problem with interfaith marriages. Nobody wanted to marry Jews, really, if they wanted to stay Jewish. So that's, of course, anti-Semitism is a whole other question because it is definitely on the rise. But anyway, that's great about the 12-step Chavurah to shul and the safety and the place and the healing and the willingness to come out of concealment. That's the whole thing. To feel safe enough to be who you really are. That's an enormous blessing. Things are beeping here. I don't know what. My stuff.
I think we're nearing the end of our time. This is, I believe, totally awesome, and I thank everybody for coming and engaging so much. I wanted to have a final question, actually asking advice on what can or Hadash do to create avenues. I remember about 35 years ago, probably, or 30 years ago, after having a small course on Jewish spirituality, some of us organized a Havurah. And it was wonderful, but people over those years have gone their own ways. And that was experiential as well as learning. A lot of us at Ordosh do Musar, and we've tried to integrate some meditation into that practice. But do you have any ideas of what Or Hadash might do to open avenues for people to access what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's great. I guess I would go, I think the major resource right now is the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. There's also the Awakened Heart Project, that's Jeff Roth, and there's a program in Israel called Or Halev that does stuff. But IJS has several things. They have they have online courses that you could do as groups. They have something called the Gift of Awareness, and they have where you get the materials from them and you work with them. They also have something called a prayer project, which are month-long courses, 4 weeks, where everybody gets their own practice, and you get the videos, and you get, and they're on different topics. There's one that I did on giving and receiving love. There's one on Hitbodedut, what that practice is about. There's one on the Sidur. There's one on embodied practice. There's one on Nigun, but they're all based on spiritual practice. And there's one on working with the Pia Zetzner, who's the Warsaw Ghetto rabbi who had very deep teachings and practices. They all involve practices, spiritual practices and conversation. So everybody does their practice and they come together live to talk about it. And IJS does retreats, again, online stuff that you could then use as the basis. They really have a lot of resources. So I would recommend that, maybe a couple people want to dig deep into what the resources are in that area. And I think that would be something. I mean, retreats are very good. You could do, when things get better, do a community retreat, do a synagogue retreat. I don't know if you've done that, but, you just, you spend the time to be together, and it really, and you have practices that are taught and teachers who teach, and an environment that feels, again, the most important thing is it feels safe to be seen and not to be in a marketplace of competition or achievement.
Thank you. I'll definitely follow up on that, and I'm sure others will. Anybody else with the last question before I defer to Manny Rosenberg, our chair of Adult Ed Committee? Okay, I just wanted to personally thank you, Rabbi Weinberg. This has been really great. And it'll be available. It's being recorded, so it'll be available if people would like to let others know about it. Somehow we'll get a link out there. Thank you. Manny.
Yeah, Rabbi Weinberg, you gave us true lechem, nourishment for the soul today. It was just so wonderful to be in your presence and learn from you. And I wanted to thank you. And I just also wanted to thank Richard Malkin, who had the concept of having this program and did a lot of work to bring it to fruition. Thank you all for attending today. It was really just a very special day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It was a delight for me to be with you all. Happy Hanukkah. Happy Thanksgiving.
Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.